Many compounds were explored by ancient alchemists. In search of a method to transform lead into gold, were they aware? Atoms contain more valuable elements than gold. Would you like extra power? Gold, despite its high price, is nothing more than a metal in comparison to that power. Good day, everyone. The latent potential of atoms is what we will be discussing today. This force will be mentioned in the video's content. How this paved the way for the development of formidable weaponry. Nothing that humanity have ever created can compare to this in terms of power. Much fiercer, this town canal is at the very top. Here we go, let's watch the video. The initial nuclear weapon attempts to blast oil with neutrons were made in 1938 by German physicists Otto Hahn and Friedrich Strassmann. If we want to locate superoils that are denser than oil, this substance's half-life is rather brief. Extremely prone to fluctuations, the results of this experiment indicate that oil will disintegrate into lighter elements when subjected to neutron bombardment. This led them to a discovery that could facilitate a fission process, which could release vast amounts of energy. The next year, Germany formally began working on a nuclear weapons program. This project is about oil. Concurrently, the so-called game board started running in the U.S. Committed to development 3 years later, it became the renowned Manhattan Project. Individuals involved in the first nuclear weapon, some very well-known individuals. The Niels Bohr group, Alessandro Fermi, John von Neumann, and Charles Feynman. Surely Cillian Murphy is a part of it as well? Should be Oppenheimer. Rob, I'm sure you're all familiar with this individual. Not long ago, a film in the same genre was released. This change's end product conducted the world's first nuclear test on July 16, 1945, over the Alamogordo Proving Ground. An atomic bomb device was detonated as part of the Trinity experiment. The explosion created a mushroom cloud that extended 12 kilometers in height and was located 290 kilometers away from the detonation site. The light is visible to you. In regards to the introductory, once the first atomic bomb had been detonated, when does this occur? No one can make a perfect prediction, not even scientists. Estimates of the explosion's power are also off. One possible explosive force at the time, according to Oppenheimer's speculations, was 300 tons of TNT. Explosive yield. Nevertheless, the reading on the device is wildly off. That's much more than expected. 21,000 tons of trinitritol is the magic number. The surrounding mountains were bathed in a brilliant light by this detonation. It feels like daybreak. Where the detonation took place, craterizing the nucleus to about 80-meter diameter, a 300-meter radius of sand additionally melted because of the extraordinarily high temperature. A gentle radioactive glass crystal formed known as trinitite. As the fires reached for the heavens, a few onlookers leaped and chortled with delight. Some individuals appear completely bewildered. The sight left me speechless. Oppenheimer said a word. Yes, he is correct. Things will change forever. An introductory submerged explosion. With the exception of the wave bomb, which they already possessed, the United States was the only nuclear power nation as the Second World War drew to a close. This bomb is easy to make, but it has a marginally worse impact. In 1946, conducted the world's first consecutive nuclear test operation Crossroads. A clandestine reporters from every corner of the globe are keeping tabs on the United States military in the first Apple test. Nuclear weapon. A number of ships were assembling when Gilda tossed it to them. The bomb has a destructive force of 23,000 tons. Hollywood actresses adorn it. The diminutive accent of Rita Hayworth. This stunning device incorporate the two ships into the web as soon as possible. 3 other ships followed. Plummet and sequence operation. Crossroads' second trial, we call it the Baker test. An underwater test had never been done before. It was really detonated 27 meters below the surface of the water. This explosion site, when compared to previous explosions, these are drastically different. No, what you see is not a mushroom-shaped plume of smoke rising into the sky. It's mostly steam and water. A flower grew from it. A mist of water resembling a cauliflower. The spectacle is quite mesmerizing. First nuclear bomb manufactured in large quantities. The Max-3 is the nuclear weapon that the U.S. uses for its tests. However, the majority of the time, this explosive is detonated by hand. Rolled-out grid management is an absolute requirement for all fabrics. Put together manually, obviously, only very qualified individuals should attempt this homework. In order to excel consequently, to speed up manufacturing, constructing a workable, mass-produced bomb is the natural progression of development. A bomb like this Marx's this explosive is not only easy to make, but also to utilize in the heat of battle. In 1949, Mark IV saw action. Roughly 550 nuclear weapons were manufactured by the U.S. Comparables can be found in the 1,000 to 30,000 kiloton range. Primary nuclear report from the USSR. Even if America is confident in its nuclear weapons acquisition capabilities, the dominant position of armaments for a little while ruled the world. The Manhattan Project, however, was underway while the USSR was involved. It is possible to get information from the U.S. through a network that has been set up for so-called nuclear espionage. Important details on nuclear testing. Consequently, following the American surprise on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union's actions, the trial at Trinity took place 4 years later. The RDS-1, the Soviet Union's first nuclear weapon, went off. The same as 20,000 tons. However, the Soviet Union has not yet developed a nuclear bomb transportation method. Yet, this matter, a persistent weapons race, was set in motion. Eventually led to the birth of a new type of nuclear weapon. Climate change initiative reaching the pinnacle of nuclear power. The goal has always been to make nuclear weapons smaller. Maximum destruction is another goal, along with the quantity of fissionable materials. This led to the United States launching the Greenhouse Initiative, the first and most crucial stage in developing a new nuclear weapon. While this work was underway in 1951, Pacific and Uatac ringed foot. It was a 4-test battery bomb. It was on May 8 when George underwent nuclear testing. This weapon has a yield of 225,000 tons. Even after a year, it was all the rage. First nuclear weapon prototype. This explosive device using a trace quantity of liquid hydrogen to produce heavy neutrons. Kawawa blade researchers were hoping this might take off as a rapid and robust neutron source. Works with fission oil, but ultimately, fusion triggers don't exist. There is little impact from the power. That being said, it's not exactly a thermonuclear weapon. There has never been an experiment with a nuclear bomb before this one. A multi-stage explosion was first used in the nuclear test. Compared to a comparable flat oil bomb, its power is twice as high, despite the smaller explosive yield of 45,500 tons. An atomic weapon developed by Britain to get the Manhattan Project forward. Britain will contribute it significantly, but not until December 3, 1952. Britain became the third country to obtain nuclear weapons as a result of hurricane operations, which was the only time they got their own atomic bomb. There is 25,000 tons of power in this atomic bomb. A bomb went off on Trimoi, an island in Theo. Atomic bombs initial stunning during Operation Greenhouse. The U.S. set the stage for a nuclear weapon. October 1, 1952, a full year later, going back to the Inevitac circuit and put a massive bomb through its paces. Ivy Mike was that monster. It was also the pioneering nuclear weapon. Yes, that is correct. Our expectations were not met by this type of explosion. We need to be more precise. In reality, it is a test arrangement. The approximate mass is 74 tons. Also furnished with a specific cryogenic apparatus. Surprisingly, Irujilab vanished after the massive explosion. It simply dissipates. A 10 million ton equivalent would be the Ivy Mac. A novel structure allows it to go far beyond the capabilities of previous nuclear weapons. In order to accomplish this, an atomic fusion event gives rise to this structure. Aids in the fission procedure. Another example will do for the purpose of comparison. American might was unleashed in the same Ivy League operation. The nuclear yield of the heaviest single-stage bomb, the King, is 500,000 tons. Just 20% of Ivy Mike's power is available. Nuclear warhead, it ends there. The design of bombs shifted to focus on thermonuclear weapons. Soviet Union's RDS-6 thermonuclear weapon went off in 1953. A one-stage detonator, this just 400,000 tons, is the equal. This bomb's theoretical yield is below 1 million tons. Thus, an alternative is required. January 1, 1954, a bikini-clad American detonated a two-stage thermonuclear weapon as part of Operation Castle's Bravo test. A sturdy knife was used to cut the explosive. Determined to take over for Liquid River and blade his influence is immense, startled everyone in the room. 15 million tons is the nuclear equivalent. More potent than previously estimated, that's 2.5 times larger. It went down in American history as well. The most devastating evaluation nonetheless, the nuclear detonation that set the planet ablaze in 1961, it was fired from a Soviet plane. The bomb detonation that the Tsar set off the destructive force of this enormous nuclear weapon as much as 58.6 million tons 1,000 kilometers away from the epicenter of the blast. The explosion's burst of light is visible. Little Starfish, the first space bomb, only 1.44 is 1. The amount of power is 1 million tons. When contrasted with the Tsar bomb, completely nothing. The first bomb to go off at 400 kilometers per hour, though, was this one. In other words, the detonation of a nuclear weapon outside of Earth's atmosphere is a significant development in the history of nuclear weapons. The year 1961 saw the U.S. administration of this project. The blast, however, is too powerful. Produced some distance out from the explosion's epicenter, far away, 1,500 kilometers away, electrons, lighting fixtures, and machinery additionally broke down. Out of all the satellites in orbit, the first one has 1/3. It is ineffective. Are you ready to put an end to this? Is this exam more useful? We offer a lot of fresh, interesting content for you, but YouTube isn't one of them. Perhaps in an instant it will vanish completely. You can show your approval of today's post by clicking the like button, as well as posting it on other social media platforms. To your loved ones and acquaintances, together, we can eagerly await the next film. Farewell.